Have you ever woken up feeling empty, restless, and spiritually dry, even though life keeps moving? This powerful morning prayer journey takes you from silence to surrender, from noise to stillness, and from longing to an unshakable awareness of God's presence. If you desire God more than success, comfort, or answers, this message is for you. Walk through brokenness, faith without feelings, quiet waiting, and refining fire until God's presence becomes the center of your life. Don't just pray out of habit. Pray until heaven draws near and your soul is forever changed. Start today, open your heart fully, and invite God to meet you in this sacred moment right now. The day begins not with celebration, but with silence. As dawn breaks and the world slowly awakens, there is a strange stillness that fills the air. One that should feel peaceful, yet instead feels heavy. Homes stir, alarms ring, and schedules resume. But beneath the surface of ordinary routines lies a quiet unrest. Many wake up already tired, not from lack of sleep, but from a soul weighed down by longing. This morning, like so many others, exposes a truth often ignored. The heart is awake, but it is not satisfied. Reports from countless lives echo the same story. Success has been chased, goals have been met, and responsibilities have been fulfilled, yet something essential is missing. Achievements no longer excite, and familiar routines feel hollow. The silence of the morning becomes uncomfortable because it forces the soul to confront what noise usually hides. In these early hours, before distractions take over, the emptiness becomes undeniable. A deep ache that no accomplishment or possession can fill. As the sun rises, many reach for their phones, their schedules, or their worries, hoping to silence the unease. But the unrest remains. The news of the heart is clear. Busyness has replaced presence. The soul was never designed to survive on motion alone. Without a connection to God, the morning feels unfinished, as though something vital has been forgotten before stepping into the day. This growing restlessness is not a sign of failure, but a signal. It reveals a hunger that goes beyond physical need or emotional comfort. The soul longs for meaning, for peace, for a presence greater than itself. In the quiet moments of the morning, that hunger speaks the loudest, exposing how far the heart has drifted from its true source of life. Observers of the human spirit note that this emptiness often appears most clearly at the start of the day. Before the world demands attention, the soul stands exposed. Without God's presence, even a new sunrise feels incomplete, and the promise of a fresh beginning fades quickly. What should be a moment of renewal instead becomes a reminder of what is missing. The morning alone cannot restore what only God's presence can fill. The silence is not the enemy. It is the messenger. It announces a deeper need, calling the heart to seek more than routine, more than success, and more than noise. It is the cry of an empty morning, inviting the soul to return to the one it was created to desire above all else. The silence that exposed the soul in the early morning does not last long. As the day begins to move, noise rushes in to take its place. Notifications light up screens, obligations line up without mercy, and the mind is pulled in 100 directions at once. What began as a quiet ache in the heart is now buried under activity. Yet the unrest from the empty morning does not disappear. It is simply covered, masked by constant motion and endless input. Reports from daily life reveal a troubling pattern. The first response to inner emptiness is rarely reflection. It is distraction. Instead of answering the call of the soul, many turn to sound, speed, and stimulation. Music plays, news scrolls endlessly, conversations overlap, and thoughts race. The noise feels comforting at first, but beneath it lies a deeper loss, the fading awareness of God's voice. As the volume of life increases, clarity decreases. The gentle whisper of God, once recognizable in stillness, becomes harder to discern. His voice does not compete with chaos. It does not shout over fear or force its way through distraction. In the rush of the day, the soul slowly forgets what it means to listen, and what was once sacred becomes distant. This chapter exposes a harsh truth. The noise is not neutral. It shapes desires, directs attention, and defines priorities. The more the heart absorbs the world's noise, the less room there is for God's presence. What began as a longing in the morning is now dulled by constant engagement, leaving the soul busy but spiritually unheard. Many begin to confuse activity with purpose. Full schedules replace quiet devotion, and productivity is mistaken for fulfillment. Yet despite the motion, something remains wrong. The heart senses that it is reacting to life rather than living from a place of divine guidance. Without God's voice, decisions become heavier, peace becomes fragile, and the soul grows weary faster than before. Observers note that this condition does not happen suddenly. It develops gradually. One skipped moment of stillness leads to another. Prayer is postponed, reflection delayed, and silence avoided. Over time, the absence of God's voice becomes normal, and the noise becomes familiar. What once felt overwhelming now feels necessary, even addictive. Still, beneath the layers of sound, the soul remembers. It remembers the quiet authority of God's presence and the peace that followed obedience to His voice. This memory creates tension, a discomfort that grows stronger the longer it is ignored. The noise can distract, but it cannot satisfy the hunger awakened in the first chapter. The heart begins to realize that the problem is not the silence of God, but the volume of everything else. God has not withdrawn. The soul has become too crowded to hear Him. This realization marks a turning point, exposing the cost of constant distraction and the danger of living without divine direction. As the day presses on, the weight of this truth becomes undeniable. The emptiness from the morning has evolved into confusion, fatigue, and quiet frustration. The soul is functioning, but it is not aligned. It moves, but without rhythm. It speaks, but without certainty. All because the voice it was meant to follow has been drowned out. If the noise continues unchecked, the soul will grow numb. But if the heart dares to quiet itself again, it may rediscover what was lost. The unrest that began in silence now points toward a deeper need, not just for peace, but for God's voice to be heard once more. The noise that drowned out God's voice does not erase memory. Even as the soul moves through a crowded day, something deeper begins to stir, a remembrance that refuses to be silenced. Beneath distraction and exhaustion, the heart recalls a time when God's presence felt real, heavy, and undeniable. This memory does not come gently. It arrives with force, reminding the soul that what it feels now is not how it was meant to live. There were moments in the past when silence did not feel empty, but full. Times when prayer was not forced, when stillness carried peace instead of anxiety. In those days, God's presence was not questioned, it was known. The heart remembers waking up with clarity, walking through life with confidence, and resting with assurance that it was not alone. Compared to that, the present noise feels thin and unsatisfying. This remembrance intensifies the ache exposed in the earlier chapters. The soul now understands what it has lost. The unrest of the morning and the confusion caused by noise are no longer vague feelings. They are contrasts. The heart measures its current emptiness against the fullness it once experienced, and the difference is painful but revealing. Observers of the inner life note that this stage is dangerous yet necessary. Remembering God's presence can either awaken repentance or deepen regret. The soul stands at a crossroads, either to dismiss the memory as nostalgia or to recognize it as a call. The weight of God's presence is not something the heart invents. It is something it once carried. As the memory grows clearer, details return. The calm that settled anxiety. The guidance that made decisions lighter. The joy that did not depend on circumstances. God's presence was not just emotional. It was stabilizing. It anchored the soul in truth, purpose, and peace. Without it, life feels louder but weaker, fuller in content yet emptier in meaning. This chapter reveals a critical truth. The soul was shaped by presence, not performance. God's nearness once defined identity more than achievements ever could. Remembering this exposes how far the heart has drifted in chasing productivity, approval, and control. The noise promised fulfillment but delivered fatigue instead. The memory also brings humility. The soul recognizes that God's presence was never earned through effort, but received through surrender. It was not forced into life. It was welcomed. Somewhere along the way, that openness was replaced with self-reliance, and listening was replaced with striving. The remembrance becomes both a comfort and a conviction. As this realization settles, longing deepens. The heart does not merely want peace again. It wants God Himself. The ache transforms from frustration into desire. The soul begins to whisper what it has not said in a long time. I want your presence back, not just your help. This longing aligns with the framework of the journey. The silence revealed emptiness. The noise exposed distraction. Now memory confirms truth. The soul was never meant to live disconnected from God's presence. What feels missing is not motivation or discipline, but intimacy with the Creator. closes with the weight of that realization pressing gently but firmly on the heart. God's presence is not forgotten. It is remembered. And what is remembered can be sought again. The soul stands awakened, aware that the restlessness it carries is not random pain, but an invitation to return to the presence it once knew and was created to desire above all else. The memory of God's presence does not leave the soul unchanged. It lingers, pressing deeper, exposing not only what has been lost but why it faded. As the weight of remembrance settles, the heart begins to see itself clearly. The distance from God was not created in a single moment of rebellion, but in countless small compromises. Moments of pride, self-reliance, and quiet neglect. What was once intimacy slowly gave way to independence, and now the soul stands exposed by truth. This realization is uncomfortable. The heart resists blame, searching for external reasons. Busyness, pressure, responsibility, fatigue. Yet none of these fully explain the absence of God's presence. Beneath them lies a harder truth. The soul stopped making room. It filled itself with control, expectations, and assumptions, leaving little space for surrender. The ache now deepens as the heart recognizes its own role in the silence. Here, the journey takes a critical turn. God's presence is not drawn to performance or perfection, but to humility. The soul begins to understand that strength did not restore intimacy before, and it will not restore it now. The presence it longs for responds to honesty, to repentance, and to a heart willing to break open rather than harden itself further. As the heart softens, layers begin to fall away. Pride loosens its grip. Defenses weaken. The soul admits its fear of stillness, its addiction to noise, and its tendency to avoid vulnerability. This is not collapse. It is surrender. The breaking is not destruction, but preparation, creating a space where God's presence can dwell again. Observers of the spiritual journey often note that this is where many turn back. Brokenness feels risky. It requires letting go of control and admitting weakness. Yet this chapter reveals a sacred paradox. The heart is never closer to God than when it stops pretending to be strong. Brokenness becomes the doorway, not the barrier. In this place, prayer changes. Words are no longer polished or strategic. They become raw, simple, and honest. The soul no longer asks for outcomes or solutions. It asks for God Himself. The hunger shifts from relief to relationship, from answers to presence. What once felt distant now feels possible. The weight of guilt begins to lift, replaced by clarity. The heart realizes that God was never waiting for perfection, only permission. His presence does not retreat from weakness. It responds to it. The soul starts to sense that the silence it feared may soon become sacred again. This chapter connects deeply to what came before. The silence revealed the emptiness. The noise masked it. Memory awakened longing. Now brokenness creates access. The journey is no longer about chasing a feeling, but about aligning the heart with truth. The soul begins to understand that God's presence is welcomed, not forced. As humility takes root, hope quietly rises. The heart no longer feels locked out, only undone, and that undoing feels strangely safe. The fear of being exposed fades as the soul senses mercy instead of judgment. Brokenness becomes a meeting place rather than a wound. Closes with a powerful shift in posture. The soul is no longer running or hiding. It kneels. In its breaking, it finally becomes still enough to receive. And in that stillness, the heart discovers the truth it had forgotten. A broken heart is not rejected by God. It is the very doorway through which His presence returns. The posture of kneeling does not end the struggle. It clarifies it. As the heart opens through brokenness, a deeper question rises, one that cannot be avoided any longer. If God's presence returns, will it truly be welcomed above all else? The soul realizes that longing alone is not enough. Desire must now become decision, because God's presence does not coexist comfortably with divided loyalty. In the quiet after surrender, competing voices grow louder. Comfort promises ease. Ambition demands attention. Fear warns of loss. Each voice argues for priority, reminding the heart of what it might have to give up. The soul begins to understand that the absence of God's presence was not accidental. It was the result of choosing other things first, again and again, without even noticing. The tension sharpens as the heart faces truth honestly. God was not merely pushed aside by failure, but by preference. Time was offered to productivity before prayer. Trust was placed in control rather than surrender. Identity was shaped by achievement instead of intimacy. This realization stings, but it also liberates, because what was chosen wrongly can now be chosen rightly. Here, the soul stands at a defining moment. God is no longer being asked to fix life, bless plans, or ease discomfort. He is being invited to take first place. The heart begins to understand that God's presence is not a supplement to life. It is the center of it. Everything else must now find its position around Him. Letting go proves harder than expected. Some attachments feel necessary, even harmless. Yet the soul senses that anything competing with God's presence, no matter how small, weakens intimacy. The heart starts releasing control slowly, laying down expectations, timelines, and outcomes. This is not loss. It is alignment. As priorities shift, fear briefly intensifies. What if choosing God costs too much? What if surrender leads to uncertainty? Yet beneath the fear, peace begins to form. The soul realizes that what it feared losing never truly sustained it. What once felt secure now feels fragile compared to the weight of God's presence. This choice reshapes desire itself. The heart no longer seeks God for what He provides, but for who He is. Blessings lose their power to distract. Success loses its authority to define worth. God becomes the reward, not the means to an end. The hunger grows purer, deeper, and more focused. Observers of the inner journey recognize this moment as a spiritual crossing. Once the heart chooses God above all else, it cannot return unchanged. Old patterns lose their grip. Old distractions lose their appeal. Life begins to reorient itself around presence instead of pressure. The soul starts to experience a strange freedom. Saying no to lesser things creates space for greater intimacy. Silence no longer feels threatening. Stillness no longer feels empty. The heart begins to sense that God is drawing nearer, responding to the decision that placed Him first. This turning point seals what brokenness began. The heart is no longer merely open. It is aligned. By choosing God over everything else, the soul prepares itself for what comes next. Not instant answers, not emotional highs, but a deeper, steadier awareness of presence that will soon require patience, trust, and faith beyond feeling. After choosing God above everything else, the soul expects immediate confirmation. It anticipates a rush of peace, a clear sign, or a powerful emotional response that proves the decision was right. But instead, what follows is silence. Not the exposing silence of emptiness from the beginning, but a quieter, heavier stillness that stretches the heart and tests its resolve. This waiting feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The soul has already surrendered control, released priorities, and chosen God first. Yet nothing seems to change on the surface. Feelings fade instead of intensifying. Emotions remain flat. The heart begins to wonder if it has done something wrong, or worse, if nothing happened at all. In this space, faith is stripped of emotional support. There is no excitement to lean on, no reassurance to hold. The soul must decide whether it will trust God's presence even when it cannot sense it. This is where belief matures. What once depended on feeling now must stand on truth alone. Doubt attempts to fill the quiet. It whispers questions that sound reasonable and dangerous at the same time. If God is near, why don't you feel Him? If He accepted your surrender, why does everything feel the same? The heart feels exposed, vulnerable, and tempted to retreat back to noise just to escape the tension of waiting. Yet something deeper is happening beneath the surface. God is teaching the soul that His presence is not an emotion to chase, but a reality to trust. The absence of feeling is not rejection. It is refinement. The heart is being trained to remain faithful without reward, steady without confirmation. This stage demands endurance. The soul must resist the urge to manufacture emotion, rush outcomes, or reclaim control. Waiting becomes an act of worship. Every quiet moment becomes a declaration. I trust you even when I feel nothing. This is not passive waiting. It is active obedience. As time passes, impatience surfaces. The heart remembers how easily it once filled silence with distraction. Now, choosing stillness feels costly. Yet returning to old patterns would undo what surrender began. The soul understands that leaving this place prematurely would mean choosing comfort over transformation. Slowly, the heart becomes steadier. Anxiety weakens. Fear loses its urgency. The soul is no longer desperate for sensation. It is anchored in decision. Faith settles deeper than emotion ever could. What once felt empty now feels expectant, as though something unseen is forming. This waiting reshapes identity. The soul is no longer defined by how strongly it feels God, but by how firmly it trusts Him. Dependence shifts from emotion to relationship. The heart learns that God's presence does not come and go with feelings. It remains, constant and faithful. The soul is quieter but stronger. It has not seen dramatic change, but it has become ready. Waiting has cleared the noise, purified desire, and strengthened faith. And now, without forcing anything, the heart stands prepared. For the moment when God's presence no longer feels distant, but draws unmistakably near. The waiting does not break suddenly. It softens. After faith has been practiced without emotion and trust has been held without evidence, the soul begins to sense a shift that cannot be forced or explained. The silence that once tested endurance now feels different. It is no longer empty or tense, but inhabited, as if something unseen has quietly entered the room. Peace is the first sign, arriving without drama. Not the kind of peace that excites but the kind that steadies. Thoughts slow down. Anxiety loosens its grip. The heart realizes it is no longer striving to feel God. It is resting in the awareness that He is near. The soul has stopped searching, and in that stillness, heaven begins to draw close. This nearness does not overwhelm the senses. There are no loud emotions or rushing feelings. Instead, there is clarity. Decisions feel lighter. Fear loses its authority. The heart feels anchored, as though it has finally returned to the place it was designed to stand. God's presence settles gently but firmly, carrying weight without pressure. The soul notices that old distractions no longer call as loudly. Noise feels unnecessary. Silence feels safe. What once required effort now comes naturally. Stillness, attention, reverence. The heart is no longer fighting to stay focused. It simply remains, aware that something holy is happening without needing to name it. In this moment, the soul understands something it could not grasp before. God's presence was never absent. It was approached differently. Feelings were never the doorway. Faith was. Waiting cleared the space. Trust prepared the ground. Now, presence arrives not as a reward, but as a response to surrender. Strength begins to rise quietly. Not emotional strength, but spiritual stability. The soul feels capable of carrying weight again. Burdens that once felt crushing now feel manageable. God's nearness does not remove responsibility, but it changes how the heart carries it. The soul is no longer alone under pressure. There is a holy reassurance in this closeness. Not answers to every question but confidence in every step. The heart no longer demands explanations. It trusts direction. God's presence becomes guidance, not through noise, but through calm certainty that settles deep within. This nearness reshapes identity. The soul stops defining itself by struggle, waiting, or lack. It begins to see itself as held, seen, and known. God's presence restores dignity, reminding the heart that it was never forgotten during the silence. It was being prepared. The moment feels sacred because it is quiet. There is no need to speak much. Prayer becomes awareness. Worship becomes stillness. The soul realizes that heaven does not always open with thunder. Sometimes it draws near with peace that cannot be shaken. The heart stands changed. It has waited without feeling, trusted without proof, and chosen God above all else. Now, heaven has drawn near, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And the soul knows this is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of walking forward carrying God's presence into everything that comes next. The nearness of heaven does not end in stillness. It gives birth to movement. After God's presence settles deeply within the soul, a quiet strength begins to rise. The heart understands that this sacred closeness was never meant to be hidden or hoarded. What was received in silence now prepares the soul to step forward, carrying God's presence into the ordinary rhythms of life. Standing up feels different now. The weight that once pressed down no longer defines posture or pace. The soul does not rush, yet it does not hesitate. There is confidence without arrogance. Calm without passivity. God's presence has reshaped the inner foundation, allowing the heart to move through the world without being ruled by it. The day ahead looks the same on the surface. Responsibilities remain, challenges persist, and uncertainty still exists. Yet something essential has changed. The soul no longer enters the day empty or defensive. It steps forward filled, aware that it is not facing life alone. God's presence becomes an inner compass, quietly guiding decisions and responses. Old fears attempt to return, but they find less room to operate. Anxiety no longer dominates thought patterns. When pressure rises, the soul does not collapse inward, it steadies itself outward in trust. God's nearness does not remove difficulty, but it transforms how difficulty is endured. The heart begins to notice how differently it responds to people. Patience grows where irritation once lived. Compassion replaces judgment. The presence that healed the soul now flows through it, touching conversations, choices, and moments that once felt insignificant. Life becomes a place where God's presence is carried, not confined. This transformation is not loud or dramatic. There are no constant emotional highs, no need to prove spiritual depth. The change is quieter and deeper. The soul walks with awareness, listening more than speaking, responding rather than reacting. God's presence becomes less of an experience and more of a reality. Strength continues to build, not from effort but from alignment. The soul no longer strives to control outcomes. It trusts direction. Even when answers are unclear, peace remains intact. God's presence provides stability that circumstances cannot steal. The journey that began with emptiness now reveals its purpose. The silence exposed need. The noise revealed distraction. Memory awakened longing. Brokenness opened the door. Choice realigned priorities. Waiting refined faith. Nearness restored intimacy. Now, transformation takes form in daily life. The soul understands that this is not a conclusion, but a way of living. God's presence will require ongoing surrender, continued listening, and daily choice. Yet the fear of losing it no longer dominates. The heart knows the path back to presence. It has walked it once and carries its wisdom forward. The soul rises, not to perform, but to live. Not to chase presence, but to walk within it. What once felt distant now becomes constant. And as the day unfolds, the heart moves forward changed, anchored, aware, and carrying God's presence into everything that comes next. What was formed in stillness now faces the weight of reality. As the soul moves forward, it discovers that God's presence is not fragile. It is resilient. The world presses in with urgency, opinions, conflict, and fatigue. Yet the inner fire does not go out. Instead, it burns steadier, teaching the heart how to remain anchored while surrounded by motion. The soul begins to recognize resistance. Not everything welcomes a life shaped by God's presence. Old habits try to reclaim ground. Familiar temptations reappear, subtle and persuasive. Yet the heart no longer responds instinctively. It pauses, listens, and chooses differently. The presence carried within becomes a filter, exposing what drains life and affirming what sustains it. Moments of pressure reveal the depth of transformation. When stress rises, the soul does not fracture as it once did. When disappointment comes, it no longer collapses inward. God's presence does not prevent pain, but it prevents despair. The heart learns that endurance is not about toughness, but about nearness, remaining close even when circumstances pull hard. The fire carried forward is not loud or aggressive. It does not demand attention. It warms rather than burns. People notice it not by words, but by steadiness, patience, and peace that does not make sense in a chaotic world. God's presence becomes a quiet testimony, speaking without explanation. The soul also learns responsibility. Carrying God's presence requires vigilance. Stillness must be revisited. Surrender must be renewed. Listening must remain intentional. The heart understands now that intimacy is not maintained accidentally. It is protected through humility, discipline, and continued choice. There are moments when the presence feels distant again. Not gone, but quieter. The soul no longer panics. It remembers the path back. Silence, honesty, surrender, trust. What once felt like loss now feels like invitation. The journey has taught the heart how to return without fear. Purpose sharpens in this stage. The soul realizes that God's presence was never meant to end at personal peace. It was given to be carried into broken places, heavy conversations, and unseen moments. The heart becomes available, willing to be used not for recognition, but for impact shaped by love. Strength matures into wisdom. The soul learns when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. God's presence provides discernment, guiding steps without rushing outcomes. Life no longer feels reactive, it feels responsive, aligned with something eternal. Looking back, the soul sees how far it has come. What began as emptiness has become fullness. What began as noise has become clarity. What began as longing has become communion. The journey reshaped not only belief, but identity itself. Closes with resolve rather than finality. The fire will be tested, the presence will be guarded, and the path will continue to unfold. Yet the soul moves forward without fear. God's presence is no longer something it seeks occasionally. It is something it carries faithfully, wherever the road leads next. The fire carried into the world begins to shape a new center of life. No longer driven by reaction, pressure, or survival, the soul now lives from a deeper place. God's presence becomes the core, not the accessory. Decisions, responses, and desires flow outward from intimacy rather than urgency. Life no longer feels scattered. It feels centered. Each day unfolds with greater awareness. The soul does not rush into noise as it once did. It recognizes how easily distraction can pull attention away from what truly matters. Now, stillness is protected, not avoided. Silence is revisited, not feared. God's presence is no longer something found only in sacred moments, but something carried into every ordinary one. Challenges still come, sometimes unexpectedly and intensely. Yet the soul meets them differently. Instead of panic, there is pause. Instead of control, there is trust. God's presence does not erase difficulty, but it reframes it. What once felt overwhelming now becomes manageable because the heart no longer stands alone. The soul learns to listen more deeply. Not just to God, but to people, to moments, to what is happening beneath the surface. Compassion grows stronger than judgment. Patience outlasts frustration. God's presence softens the heart without weakening conviction, allowing love and truth to coexist without conflict. Temptation also returns, but it no longer feels irresistible. The soul recognizes that many former struggles were rooted in emptiness. Now that the center is filled, lesser things lose their power. The presence of God satisfies in ways that habits, approval, and control never could. Freedom feels natural rather than forced. Purpose becomes clearer in this stage. The soul understands that living from God's presence is not about escape from the world, but engagement with it in a new way. Work becomes worship. Conversations become opportunities. Even suffering becomes a place where God's nearness can be revealed rather than hidden. There are still moments of weakness. The soul stumbles, doubts, and grows tired. Yet failure no longer defines identity. God's presence remains constant, inviting restoration rather than condemnation. The heart has learned how to return, quickly, honestly, and without shame. Gratitude begins to replace striving. The soul no longer measures life by what is missing, but by what has been given. Even small moments carry weight. A breath, a quiet prayer, a simple act of obedience becomes meaningful because it is done in awareness of God's nearness. Looking ahead, the soul no longer fears the future. It understands that God's presence will not disappear with changing seasons. What was built through silence, surrender, waiting, and trust is not temporary. It has become a way of life, rooted deeper than circumstance. Closes not with an ending, but with establishment. The soul stands firm, living from the center of God's presence. What began as longing has become alignment. What began as searching has become dwelling. And from this place, the heart continues forward, not chasing God, but walking with Him, every step grounded in the presence it once desired more than anything. Living from the center of God's presence does not mean every season feels intense or alive with fire. After the soul has learned to dwell, a quieter season often follows. The passion does not disappear, but it settles deeper, no longer demanding expression. The heart begins to understand that abiding is not sustained by constant intensity, but by faithfulness when nothing feels urgent or dramatic. In this season, the soul faces a subtle challenge. When God's presence becomes familiar, it is easy to grow casual. What was once protected with devotion can slowly be taken for granted. The heart must now choose attentiveness without desperation, devotion without emotional pressure. This is where maturity is tested, not in hunger, but in consistency. The quiet reveals new layers of trust. The soul no longer seeks reassurance that God is near. It lives as though He is. Prayer becomes less about words and more about awareness. Worship becomes less expressive and more embodied, woven into actions, decisions, and posture. God's presence becomes a constant companion rather than a momentary encounter. Yet this quiet can feel unsettling. The soul remembers seasons of intensity and wonders if something has been lost. Doubt tries to redefine calm as distance. But wisdom begins to rise, reminding the heart that roots grow in silence, not storms. What feels uneventful is often where endurance is formed. Daily life becomes the proving ground. Ordinary frustrations, unnoticed choices, and unseen faithfulness now matter more than dramatic moments. The soul learns that obedience in small things protects intimacy more than passion in rare ones. God's presence remains steady, not because it is felt strongly, but because it is honored faithfully. There are days when weariness creeps in. Responsibilities feel heavy again. Old emotions resurface. But the soul no longer interprets struggle as spiritual failure. It understands that abiding includes perseverance. God's presence does not vanish when strength fades. It sustains the heart through it. Humility deepens here. The soul stops measuring spiritual health by sensation and starts measuring it by alignment. Are choices still shaped by presence? Is silence still honored? Is surrender still practiced? These questions guide the heart more reliably than feelings ever did. The relationship with God becomes less fragile. The soul no longer fears losing his presence over minor missteps. Restoration feels closer, quicker, and gentler. Trust replaces anxiety. The heart knows now that God is not easily offended, but deeply committed. This season refines love itself. The soul loves God not because he feels near, but because he is worthy. Devotion becomes quieter, purer, and stronger. What once depended on experience now stands on relationship. The heart has learned how to remain. Closes with stability rather than climax. The soul stands rooted, grounded in presence that does not fluctuate with emotion. The fire still burns, but it burns within, steady, enduring, and faithful. And in this abiding, the heart prepares for whatever season comes next, confident that God's presence will remain, not because it is chaste, but because it is honored. Abiding quietly prepares the soul for a deeper test, believing when nothing visibly changes. After learning to remain steady without emotional fire, the heart now encounters seasons where progress feels invisible. Life moves forward, prayers seem unanswered, and circumstances remain stubbornly unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, faith is being asked to stand without evidence. This stage challenges expectation. The soul remembers how presence once transformed everything quickly, how peace arrived, how clarity followed surrender. Now, the absence of visible movement feels confusing. Doubt whispers that faith should always produce results. But the heart is learning a harder truth. Endurance matters more than immediacy. Waiting returns, but it feels different from before. It is no longer the restless waiting of longing, nor the refining waiting of silence. It is the waiting of trust, continuing to live aligned even when outcomes remain hidden. The soul chooses obedience not because it sees results, but because it knows who it belongs to. God's presence feels quieter again, not distant, but restrained. The soul senses that heaven is working beyond perception. Faith stretches into the unseen, anchoring itself in character rather than confirmation. What once relied on reassurance now rests on relationship. Daily faithfulness becomes costly here. Doing the right thing without applause, praying without emotion, trusting without progress. The soul realizes that this is where many retreat, not because God left, but because visibility did. Yet something stronger is forming. Resilience rooted in truth rather than reward. The heart learns to release timelines. Control dissolves further. Faith becomes patient, no longer demanding speed. The soul accepts that God's work often happens in layers, beneath awareness, beyond immediate understanding. What feels delayed is often being deeply prepared. Fear attempts to return during this season. It warns that nothing is happening, that effort is wasted, that alignment is pointless. But the soul now recognizes fear's voice. It does not obey it. It stands, grounded in presence even when presence feels quiet. Strength matures again, this time into endurance. The soul stops measuring success by change and starts measuring it by faithfulness. Even when circumstances resist transformation, the heart remains steady. God's presence becomes less about experience and more about covenant, unchanging and reliable. Looking back, the soul notices subtle shifts. Reactions are calmer. Trust is quicker. Fear has less authority. Though nothing dramatic happened outwardly, something irreversible